I think it's safe to say that, generally speaking, when a person is competing in a sport, they're amongst the living at the time. Having passed away is highly detrimental to athletic achievements, amongst many other things. Would it surprise you, though, to learn that one athlete did, in fact, win a competition while deceased? And this isn't a case of some kind of posthumous honorary award being given to someone for sentimental reasons. This person's suddenly lifeless body, along with the still functioning body of his horse, were the first to cross the finish line, legitimately winning a race. Allow me to introduce you to Frank Hayes. He was either born in Ireland or, according to one source, to an Irish American family in New York, and was either born in 1888 or 1901. Differing sources somehow have two completely separate but similar backstories for this guy. I know record keeping wasn't as pristine back at the turn of the 20th century as it is now, but a 13-year age difference and two different birth countries seems a bit odd. As murky as Hayes' origins are, what is clear about him is that he competed in the steeplechase at Belmont Park in New York on June 4th, 1923. Most sources agree that he was a horse trainer, and for that day he had to serve as a fill in jockey. For whom he was standing in and why, at this point, seems lost to history, at least according to the sources I can find. In many tellings of the history of Frank Hayes, there's an almost romanticized subplot about him wanting to be a jockey, but being slightly too heavy for the job. Now, modern horse racers are often some of the smallest folks walking around that don't have legitimate growth impediments. The ideal size for a modern jockey is mostly agreed upon to be between 4 foot 10 to 5 foot 6 inches tall, or 1.47 to 1.68 meters, with a weight between 112 and 126 pounds, or 51 to 57 kilograms. At that size, a modern rider would still be slightly smaller than the average American man in 1923, who would have stood about 5 foot 7 or 1.7 meters and weighed around 150 pounds or 68 kilograms. Granted, sports weren't as hyper specialized as they are today, so it's less likely the horsemen of the era would have been as relatively diminutive, but the owners of the horses still wanted the smallest qualified guys they could find riding the animals. And that would be a problem for Frank Hayes. About a day before his ill fated victory, he weighed in at either 140 or 142 pounds. Again, the sources aren't in perfect alignment here. Apparently, the owner of Sweet Kiss, the horse who would be running the race, wanted the equine's rider to be 130 pounds. So Hayes, whether out of some lifelong dream to be a jockey or out of a pragmatic approach of, if I don't get on this horse, no one will and my team won't be allowed to race, decided he would be the man for the job. But to be the man for the job, he had to drop at least 10 pounds in one day. Cutting weight is actually still very common in modern combat sports, particularly amateur wrestling, boxing, and mixed martial arts. Even with current training regimens, coaches and trainers monitoring the athletes, and a thorough understanding of how dehydration can affect the human body, many combat sports practitioners per year still wind up getting hospitalized as a result of trying to cut weight for a fight. And keep in mind that in 1923, a lot of this kind of information was either unknown or at least not widely disseminated. Medically, we as a species weren't still stuck in the not knowing our ass from a hole in the ground stage that we were in when, say, we were drilling holes in people's heads to let the madness out, but at the time of Frank Hayes' race, we didn't understand nearly as much about human physiology as we do now. And even by modern standards, cutting 10 pounds in a day is considered an extremely ill advised thing to try. The generally accepted limit for how much weight a person can safely lose over a 24-hour period is 1% of their total body weight. 1% of Frank Hayes' body weight would have been around 1.4 pounds. He was going to attempt to lose at least 7 times that value in a day. That's dangerous under the best of circumstances, and being in the 1920s wasn't the best of circumstances for a weight cut like this. Hayes' method of choosing to lose the weight was simply to jog for several hours and not drink any water. By the time he took his position in the saddle on race day, he was described as looking, quote, weak and tired. But that was not going to stop Hayes from racing. He had tried to lose the weight in order to put himself in the exact position he now found himself in. He wasn't going to let a little thing like fatigue stop him now. And so, the race started. And lo and behold, Sweet Kiss, the 20 to 1 shot to win, ridden by Frank Hayes, a fill in jockey with no race experience who had to try to drop 10 pounds just to compete, actually managed to win the race. Sweet Kiss crossed the finish line one head length in front of the second place horse. Through determination and innate skill, Frank Hayes had pulled it off. He'd won. He'd not only achieved his dream of being a jockey, he was a winning one at that. There is one small detail that stops this from being a true Cinderella story, though. When Sweet Kiss's owner, a woman by the name of Miss A.M. Frayling, approached the animal and rider to congratulate them, Frank Hayes slumped out of the saddle and fell off Sweet Kiss. The track physician, Dr. John A.H. Voorhees, was immediately summoned to attend to the fallen Hayes. The latter was pronounced dead at the scene. Sometime during the steeplechase, or immediately after, Hayes had suffered a fatal heart attack. Initially, some news outlets covering the story linked the cardiac episode with the excitement of winning the race. They reasoned that in his diminished state from dehydration, the very act of victory pumped his heart rate up enough to trigger his demise. I personally find that a bit hard to believe. I play poker as a hobby and have won a few tournaments. In those victories, I did not immediately keel over after the final card was dealt, and I'm in way worse shape than Hayes was before the race. I do want to state that I am not a doctor, and what I'm about to say is by no means a qualified medical opinion, so taking what I'm about to say with a grain of salt is acceptable here. My guess, though, is that the physical stress of the race, coupled with the strain of attempting a severe weight cut the day before, combined to force Hayes into cardiac arrest. But Hayes, despite being deceased, was still in the saddle when Sweet Kiss crossed the finish line, so does that count? I was curious about what the rules of horse racing have to say about a rider who's no longer living winning a competition. I went so far as to download the general regulations for HISA, or the Horse Racing Integrity and Safety Authority, the governing body for horse races in the United States. I searched the document for a few terms like alive and living. Those words do not appear in the text. From what I can tell, there's nothing in the regulations that states a jockey actually has to be alive. For the second time in my sports related content videos, we're invoking Air Bud rules here. Ain't no rule says you gotta be living to win a steeplechase. I would imagine, though, if you tried to strap a corpse onto a horse before a race, the governing body probably wouldn't allow it. That would be considered distasteful, disrespectful, and creepy as hell. It would probably lead to questions like, hey, where did you get that corpse? Should we be calling the police? And statements like, I think we should be calling the police. But apparently, the people that wrote the rulebook never considered what would happen if a rider started the race alive but passed away mid contest. To be fair, that is so unlikely that there is exactly one recorded instance of it in 6.5 millennia of horse racing, so I think they can be forgiven for not covering it. That specific rule, if it existed, would likely reside in the same section of the rulebook that covers, I don't know, alien invasions and kaiju attacks. Given the rules, it stands to reason that since Frank Hayes was alive when the race started and stayed in the saddle until after Sweet Kiss crossed the finish line, that he was, in fact, the rightful winning jockey for the race. Needless to say, with a dead man now lying on the ground, all post race ceremonies and festivities were cancelled. This included the typical weigh in that would occur after such an event, so there's no way of knowing how much water weight Hayes had actually managed to shed prior to taking the reins. Hayes would be buried 3 days later, still dressed in the silk riding gear he'd donned for the race. There's no record of Sweet Kiss competing after the fateful race with Hayes in the saddle. Some gave the horse the new moniker of Sweet Kiss of Death, which might be the most morbid thing I've covered on this channel so far. Plus, with athletes being second to sailors in the incredibly superstitious category, no one apparently wanted to ride the horse, as if the animal were somehow cursed. The Guinness Book of World Records now lists Frank Hayes as a record holder, being the only jockey to achieve victory after his own death. Which is a really strange thing to be in the list of world records if you think about it. Winning a race while deceased is certainly an oddity, but records are usually things that are competed for. I mean, who's going to try to compete with that? How would you even compete with that? It's not like you can die during a race, win, come back to life, and repeat the process. At best, and by best I mean worst, I think, the record in question could only be tied, not bested. So that's the story of Frank Hayes, the most likely Irishman, somewhere between his early 20s to mid 30s, for whom the only thing that seems to be certain about him is that he's the only man to have not let his own literal death stop him from winning a horse race. If you enjoyed this piece, or have any actual concrete evidence about the background of Frank Hayes that I somehow didn't find, please feel free to comment on, like, or share the video. Also, please feel free to subscribe to the channel. As always, thanks for watching.